In 1986, a brutal killer terrorized South London. He targeted the elderly and became known as the Stockwell Strangler. In the summer of 1986, London police investigated a particularly callous murder. The victim was Florence Tisdall, an 80-year-old widow who lived alone with her cats. Her neighbors were shocked.
It really hasn't sunk in. She was a kind, lovely, lovely person. It's just crazy.
Florence was the latest victim in a baffling series of South London murders. Police had a sketch of what the killer might look like. But no one knew when he would attack next. Five separate command centers were set up, and police followed every lead. As the hunt intensified, more than 350 officers were brought to the area. Elderly people were warned to keep their doors and windows locked. Since April, the Stockwell Strangler had struck 8 times. His targets were elderly men and women between the ages of 67 and 94. Each attack had taken place in the early hours of the morning when the victims were asleep. But in June, one intended victim survived to tell the tale.
We've been in touch with all the old folks' homes in the area, and we've discovered that an elderly gentleman was attacked in his room in an old folks' home last Friday morning.
He was 73-year-old Frederick Prentice, who awoke at 3 a.m. to find someone in his room. Terrified, Frederick was dragged out of bed and thrown against a wall. The attacker then ran off. A few days earlier, 2 elderly men who lived in a nearby building were not so lucky. Zbigniew Stabrawa and Valentin Gleim were both strangled. Everyone was put on guard.
Well, I would like all the elderly people and anybody who has control of elderly people or who has an elderly person living nearby to be extra vigilant and to report to us anything that may have happened in the past that we don't know about already, because we can lose valuable clues in this way.
At the same time, a murderer was stalking the streets of Paris. The so-called Granny Killer had murdered 32 people in 2 years. No one thought it was the same murderer, but Interpol became involved. British and French police now compared notes on a series of murders that were remarkably similar. A psychological profile of the Stockwell Strangler suggested he probably had a grudge against his parents or grandparents.
Usually if one looks at the history of people who do this sort of thing with older people, you find some sort of a history of sexual abuse of some kind in early life, whether of him or of his own relatives. But also you tend to find perhaps that they've had some kind of thrill at seeing a dead body, or perhaps been made to kiss a dead relative's corpse goodbye, that sort of thing.
In the absence of any real clues, and only a hazy idea of what the killer looked like, police had very little to go on. But they maintained a vigilant presence in South London, doing all they could to reassure elderly residents. It was not enough. Quite a few decided to stay with relatives until the killer was caught. Then at last, there was a breakthrough. A palm print found at the scene of one of the murders matched a print police had on file. The suspect was arrested without struggle in July 1986 while collecting his benefit check at a South London Social Security office. He was 23-year-old Kenneth Erskine, a young man with a history of violent and unpredictable behavior. Police was certain Erskine was the Stockwell Strangler But because he had a mental age of 11, there was no way to get a coherent confession from him. His trial was held in the Old Bailey in January 1988. 17 days later, the lonely, friendless drifter was found guilty and sentenced to 40 years in prison. With Erskine behind bars, the elderly residents of South London felt safe again. Following Erskine's conviction, police closed the files on 4 other unsolved murders between February and July 1986. Each had the hallmarks of the Stockwell Strangler.